Alright, so today we're going to cover what's kind of going on in the rest of Europe and also on the North African and the Pacific fronts of the war. So, by December 22nd, directly after the attacks on Pearl Harbor, Prime Minister Churchill was at the White House and he wanted to make plans with FDR for the war. So Churchill had kind of been waiting for us to get involved. He knew that he wouldn't really be able to stop Hitler on his own, and he was just waiting for the U.S. to get involved. So Churchill convinced FDR that Germany and Italy were bigger threats than Japan. And even though the United States was reeling from the attacks of Japan, he encouraged him to strike at Hitler first. He said the only way to get to Japan was through Hitler. So one of the first things that happened after America enters the war is the Battle of the Atlantic. So Hitler tries to, again, prevent food and war materials, tries to break up those supply lines from reaching Great Britain and the Soviet Union, and he ordered submarine raids against ships along America's east coast. So he believed by cutting this lifeline, the supply lines, he'd win the war. And for the first couple of months, it looked like he would succeed. So in the first 4 months of 1942, the Germans sank 87 ships. 7 months in, the tally was up to 681. And finally, the Allies organized their ships into what they called convoys. So ships kind of traveled together for mutual protection, and they were escorted both by destroyers equipped with sonar to kind of figure out where the submarines were, and also airplanes equipped with radar so that they could see kind of on the surface where those submarines were coming from. So this kind of it kind of changed the tide. Germans were not nearly as successful as they were in the beginning, and the tide of the battle had changed by 1943. So this is just kind of an example of a convoy. There'd probably be at least 15 more ships in the convoy, and you can see the airplane is kind of escorting them for protection. Alright, so on the Eastern Front, as in Russia, in 1943, Allied forces finally began seeing victories on land as well as at sea. So the first big turning point victory on land was the Battle of Stalingrad. So Germans had been fighting in the Soviet Union since 1941, but everybody knows how awful Russian winters are. So winter had put a stop to their fighting. When the spring of 1942 rolled around, German tanks were ready to roll again, and Hitler's goals for the summer were to capture the extremely valuable oil fields in the Caucasus Mountains and wipe out Stalingrad, which was a major industrial center for Russia, or the Soviet Union, excuse me. So the German army approached Stalingrad thinking that it would be a pretty easy target and a rapid victory. And at first it was. By September they controlled 9/10 of the city. But then winter came and whooped them again. So when winter came, Soviets saw an opportunity to launch a counterattack. They were used to the winter, they knew how to deal with it. And so they did launch that counterattack. They kind of surrounded the Germans in Stalingrad, cut off their supply lines, so Germans were freezing, they were starving, and they had no ammo to protect themselves. This led to German surrender at the beginning of February, and the Soviet Union ended up losing over 1 million soldiers defending Stalingrad, and that's more than the U.S. lost in the whole war, which, I mean, is significant. But you have to think about the population of the Soviet Union as well. So they didn't lose, maybe percentage-wise, it wasn't as bad as it seems right now. So Stalingrad was pretty much completely destroyed by the battle. This is a part of the city, looks maybe like it had been a factory or apartment buildings, office buildings maybe. And this is pretty much what the whole city looked like. the German Luftwaffe had come in and destroyed a lot of it before they even started being on the ground with tanks. So kind of like what happened with the Blitzkrieg in Britain, they did the same thing here. And then you have shells, you have gunfire. This is, what's left of the city at this point in time. All right, so on the African front, which you may kind of think, what does Africa have to do with anything? But Stalin encouraged Britain and America to open a second front in Western Europe because he thought that an invasion across the English Channel would make Hitler kind of divert some of his troops away from the Soviet Union. And while Churchill and FDR could see where Stalin was coming from, they weren't sure that they had the manpower to launch an attack on European soil yet. So they launched Operation Torch instead. So this was an invasion of Axis-controlled North Africa, and this was commanded by General Dwight D. Eisenhower. So in 1942, Allied troops landed in Africa and engaged in heavy fightings with the Afrika Korps, which were basically just the German African troops that were stationed in Africa. And the last of the Afrika Korps surrendered in May 1943. So 6 months later, the fighting in Africa was done. It wasn't so much a territorial victory for the Allied powers, but it was an awesome morale booster. So the men who were fighting in Africa were boosted. People who heard about the victory were boosted because they kind of just realized that maybe they could win this war if they had, the right amount of spirit and the right tactics. So, the Italian campaign. Roosevelt and Churchill met in Casablanca in northern Africa to discuss their next moves. So right after their success in Africa, they met to decide what they would do next. One of the things they agreed on was to only accept the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. So at the end of the war, their enemy nations would have to accept whatever terms the Allies offered. So there was going to be no negotiation. It was what they offered they were going to have to take. And they also discussed where to strike next. So Americans had the kind of go big or go home mentality, and they argued that it was time for an invasion across the English Channel through France and into Germany. Whereas Britain thought it would be safer to attack Italy first. So they went with that option. And Sicily was captured in the summer of 1943, and it happened pretty quickly. So Mussolini, who was, we know, the leader there in that time, was fired and arrested by the government because of how quickly Sicily was overrun by the Allied powers. Hitler was determined to stop the Allies to keep them in Italy rather than to fight on German soil. So he launched one of the hardest fought battles of the war, and it was called Bloody Anzio. It lasted 4 months and left about 25,000 Allied casualties. But Italy still wasn't won, and Italy was never really won until the end of the war in 1945. It was just kind of a contested area. It wasn't really important enough to anybody to merit really trying to win it. Alright, so the heroes of Anzio. So some of the bravest men during the Battle of Anzio were what we know as the Tuskegee Airmen. So it was the all-black 99th Pursuit Squadron. So they won 2 distinguished unit citations for their aerial combat against the German Luftwaffe in Italy. Another African-American unit that won distinguishes was the 92nd Infantry Division, which were nicknamed the Buffaloes. And in 6 months of fighting, they won 7 Legion of Merit awards, 65 Silver Stars, and 162 Bronze Stars for courage while under fire. Japanese Americans also served as well in the war. The 100th Battalion was made up of 1,300 Hawaiian Nisei. And Nisei are just American citizens whose parents had immigrated from Japan. So the people, they were American, but their parents were Japanese immigrants. And they were obviously from Hawaii. So they saw absolutely brutal combat and became known as the Purple Heart Division because of the amount of them who were wounded. So you know a Purple Heart is an award if you are wounded in battle. And they ended up merging with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. It was an all-Nisei and became the most decorated unit in U.S. history. And as far as I know, they're still the most decorated unit in U.S. history. Alright,